Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to do my 14.21 top lane tier list. So if you have content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a lot of changes this patch. Most of it is still follow-up from 14.19's changes, trying to address some of the outliers from the big set of changes towards the item system. Mostly just nerf downs towards the items, but it really benefited a lot of extended combat champions, which obviously benefit from there being more health in the pool, and damage just being generalistically lower down, oftentimes resulting them not being one-shot as frequently. But let's go to the tier list. So the D tier is actually going to get a bit of a shift around here. We're going to have the addition of Swain, who did get reworked this patch. They tried to push him more towards being a bit more consistent, but overall the changes just haven't really landed that well. I imagine he'll either get hotfix buffed alongside maybe hotfix nerfs to the likes of Corki, who is really overperforming this patch. I haven't added Corki onto a top lane tier list, but he is definitely still viable here as an option. They went a bit overboard with the changes, so I definitely imagine they'll drag some of that back. But Swain, yeah, underperforming at the moment, should probably get buffed either next patch or in a hotfix. For the moment though, I'd recommend avoiding him, especially in solo queue. If you want to play him in draft and just like learn the champion, then yeah, that's perfectly reasonable, but he is definitely not performing that well at the moment. Smolder and Vayne remain in my D tier. Smolder is a lock here. Vayne could arguably be a bit higher. Both nerfs did hit her this patch. She tends to be a bit more matchup dependent. There are definitely some matchups where you can really abuse, and oftentimes if you're not getting consistently ganked or pushed out of the game, you can definitely find those edges within the fights and like really, yeah, just snowball from those. Not something I'd really recommend for mid and low elo though. This champion tends to be a bit too volatile, and if you ever find yourself falling behind, it can feel really hard to ever find your footing in the game, as you're a very single target, lack of wave clear champion. Moving down, we have two champions, and that is Rumble and Yasuo. In Yasuo's case, he obviously got tagged by Bork being nerfed this patch, thus he drops from the C tier down to the D tier. He was kind of hanging on in the C tier. He does tend to underperform in the top lane, mostly viable as like an anti-ranged option here. In Rumble's case, he got he's been nerfed quite aggressively for competitive. He's still viable there as a really early game dominant champion with a really useful ultimate within that environment, but for solo queue, he's just really fallen off at this point, so he does also drop down to the D tier. Moving up, we have Cassante, who is doing better with the hotfix he received to the changes, which obviously was a couple patches ago. I believe that was in 14.19 when Cassante received his overhaul, trying to push him more towards being less of a pro staple. It'll be interesting to see where the changes obviously land him, whether he does end up being consistently a pro pick, which I still imagine he will be. I'm not a huge fan of the direction they took with the changes. The champion just feels considerably worse for it and a bit more stat checky, but he's definitely doing a bit better in low elo, mid and low elo at the moment. Obviously being a tank does help him a bit there, as tanks obviously have more room for error. Cassante is an skill explosive tank, so he does obviously drop down considerably because of that, but he does sit within my C tier for the moment, so he's not bottom of the barrel, but there are definitely a lot of other things which I would recommend over him as tank options. Vladimir also moves up from the D tier to the C tier. Most people have finally moved on to other builds than the Grasp variation, which was mostly just dragging him down at this point. The problem with the other build, though, is it's still not great. It looks to be that Storm Surge is still his best rush option. Cosmic Drive just isn't really cutting it for him at the moment. Once again, he's a champion, which I wouldn't be surprised if he did end up getting buffed in 14.22, as he is still pretty underperformant in his current state. Other champions within the C tier which remain are Jace, who obviously is a very elite skewed pick. Not something I'd really ever recommend for mid elo unless the champion obviously is very stat checky in nature. He tends to outperform in mid lane obviously, but in top lane, yeah, there's more room for error here. If you ever fall behind, then it can really be quite a struggle to ever find your footing within the game. In Darius and Olaf's case, these two champions just haven't been great for a while. Obviously their frustration comes from their oppressive early game, but translating out of early game, these champions just don't provide anywhere near as much value as like some of the other ones at the top. Obviously, if you feed them a lot of resources, then they can definitely be powerful, and if you do obviously int into them, then they will snowball games and can win through that. But with Stridebreaker being considerably weaker, Ghost being considerably weaker, the two champions just not being great in the current environment, they do currently sit within my C tier. And then Quinn is my other champion, which remains in C tier. This champion is just better in the mid lane. It's where I'd recommend running that Profane Hydra, Symbiotic Souls variant, or Stridebreaker. Really depends on what you go. Obviously, Stridebreaker is like the Kerberos variant of the build. But Quinn in the top lane underperforms at the moment, isn't a particularly healthy champion for the game, so I don't imagine she'll get buffed at any point, but she kind of sits in this pretty awkward spot. If you're an OTP, you're still going to play the champion. If you're not an OTP, you're not really going to look at Quinn as like an option to play. The other champion dropping down is going to be Gwen. Gwen got hit pretty heavily this patch. She is obviously a very skill-expressive champion and tends to be pretty elite skewed. Her main strength came from the fact that she was just overloaded with damage, but now they've stripped a lot of that away from her this patch. She definitely does sink down from like the A tier, I believe. I had her as like a good A tier pick, all the way down to the C tier. She's definitely struggling a lot more now. Camille is pretty close to dropping down to the C tier. She does lead out the B tier at the moment. Both these champions got hit very hard. Obviously were great elite staples, two of the best elite picks in the game, but definitely for the average player base after their nerfs, struggling a lot more. In Camille's case, they took away some of her base health, they took away some of her flat W damage, her EAD ratio, they took away all of the flat damage on her ultimate. That is a lot of damage to strip down from this champion, so she has definitely suffered this patch. She drops from the S tier to the B tier. Other champions within the B tier, we have Akali, who is doing better in the top lane at the moment. Definitely has like different build variations, whether that's like the Lich Bane, the Storm Surge, the Shadow Flame, the Liandry's. There are definitely things which are competitive on Akali at the moment. And overall, yeah, she's a solid B tier option. If you're comfortable on Akali, you're still going to play her in her current state. If you're not someone who plays Akali, once again, kind of akin to Quinn, you're just not really playing the champion. Pantheon. Okay, I'm really tempted to move this champion back down to the C tier. The buff was nice, and it did just about push him back up into the B tier, but he is still a very low B tier option. He's very, very predicated on having an early game advantage and utilizing that to really take over the map, because if you don't, you're really weak later on. Your damage tends to be pretty isolated. Your build, if not ahead of the curve, feels really lackluster, and yeah, if you're stuck on Eclipse for a long time in the game, you're really going to struggle. This champion definitely sits towards the lower end of the B tier, but definitely still has an impressive early laning phase, which does give him some merit to being played. Udyr sits towards the high end of the B tier, tends to just be an OTP pick. You don't really see him being played by the general or like player base. If you're comfortable on Udyr, he's perfectly fine as a top lane option. He is really good level 1 with his RR combo. Combined with that, he does have relatively good itemization in the Liandry and the Deadmans. His nerf did drop him down from the A tier to the B tier, but he's still a high B tier option. Unlike Camille, I'd say Udyr has a bit more potential at the moment as like a higher up option. Riven benefited from her buffs. She's still an elite skewed pick. You still want to put an absurd amount of time into playing Riven. If you're not willing to do that, don't play the champion. If you are, then yeah, go ahead. The champion's definitely doing a lot better than she has done in the past at the moment. The AD ratio, or the translation of total AD ratio to like a more aggressive bonus AD ratio makes it so she scales incredibly aggressively off like AD. Like if you come back onto double longsword, this champion scales enormously off like those kind of spikes. So just be cognitive and aware of that if you are playing Riven. But she does have like the auto cancels and like making sure your damage weaving where possible is a lot of the skill expression of this champion, and if you're not comfortable doing that, you just lose so much power on this pick and it's just not worth playing. Gangplank moves up from the C tier to the B tier. The champion, also akin to Riven, is very hard to pilot. If you're not rotating barrels correctly, then this champion will once again lose a lot of value. If there's anyone to watch, I'd recommend watching Solar Baka. For Riven, watching Alois obviously is a good one to go to. Don't have any Aurelia players off the top of my head which are good to watch. This champion obviously is also pretty hard to pilot. The buffs to her this patch did push her from the C tier to the B tier. But yeah, kind of akin to the other two champions here. Not really going to be played unless you have sunk a lot of time into it and like really know the damage thresholds to make sure you can snowball and get the advantages in laning phase which you need. Garen is in the B tier. This champion probably needs to get buffed at some point. I know lots of people hate Garen because obviously he's very simple, very brain dead. Spins and snowballs the game can feel quite oppressive. The champion lost a lot of power with Stridebreaker being nerfed, lost power with melee phase rush being nerfed as well. So it does look to be leaning back once again to Conqueror as being like a very solid option on him. Zerka's got nerfed quite aggressively, lost a decent amount of power there. Overall, yeah, Garen, definitely on the downward at the moment, sits as more like a mid to low beta option. For the simplistic nature of his kit, he should probably be in an A tier pick as like standard, but at the moment, yeah, he's slightly underpowered. Definitely going to be sat within my B tier. Gragas, I'm not a huge fan of this champion in terms of the like the way it functions within the game. I think it's pretty unhealthy. As a strength pick, he's perfectly fine. Like, if you can get advantages on Gragas through his very consistent laning phase, like once you pick up like a tier or some mana, whether that's like through Lost Chapter or Catalyst, then this champion can be quite valuable. He has very good wave clear. He has good burst damage. Like, honestly, if you can find angles for like lethal within laning phase, then this champion can be quite oppressive within games, especially if you're pairing it alongside the likes of a Luden's Companion, for example. That can be quite a lot of burst damage accessible to this kind of a pick. Fiora, a very skill expressive champion, kind of akin to, once again, like your Aurelias, your Gangplanks, your Rivens. If you put a lot of time into this champion, she will still be your good staple option into a lot of the heavy CC picks. She's very good at nullifying specific matchups. If you don't, once again, it's not really a champion you're going to be looking at playing. I'd say these four here and Gwen, definitely some of the more skill expressive top laners. I think Camille, over time, has become less expressive in her skill, but she has been quite aggressively nerfed, so she does kind of line up with some of these champions, but is a bit easier to have access to, as her kit tends to be a bit more accessible, I'd say. Yone also sits within my beta. Another one of these champions, once again, very skill expressive. If you can find those kill angles and snowball throughout the game, he can be really valuable. If you're not, and you're not finding advantages, then he will feel once again quite lackluster compared to some of the other statistic options within the top lane. The nerfs to Bork and the direct nerfs to him this patch drop him from like a mid to high beta option to more like a mid to low beta option. Once again, if you're able to snowball, get advantages, he can be really valuable to your draft. If you're going like 0-1 with like a slight CS advantage or a slight CS discrepancy, then he can feel really lackluster and oftentimes just get bursted down before fights can really be accessible to him. Kayle and Teemo. So Kayle, I originally moved up. I think this champion probably is the closest thing to A tier at the moment. The one thing prohibiting me from moving her up is just how abusable she is during her early to mid game. She does have a strong level 1. Obviously, most people know that at this point, that this champion can be quite stat checky level 1. But past that, this champion can really, really struggle until it's getting like its late game power spikes with like a Natural Rabadon, level 16 kind of angle. That could definitely be a lot punishing. The thing with the buffs this patch, obviously making W a bit more accessible, making it a bit more spammable with laning phase, definitely gives her some more excess HP to work with. Like, you're getting maybe one more cast of the ability off in laning phase, which can be, that's a decent amount of HP, obviously. Like, if you add that to, like, flat HP values, that's, like, plus 60, I want to say, like, as, like, how much it heals you, which is nice. The main problem with Kayle, though, yeah, once again, is how abusable she is within the mid game. Is she champion I'd really recommend playing? Probably not, but she's definitely a lot more successful now, close to the A tier, but not quite there in my opinion. Teemo is an A tier option. Teemo's a high A tier option, but buffs this patch to his base health, combined with the W movement speed, were just a bit unnecessary. This champion's was perfectly fine in the previous patch, so the buffs have just pushed him from like a high B tier option to a high A tier option. He's really accessible at the moment. He's just had an ASU, and if you enjoy playing Teemo, go ahead. He's in a good spot. Poppy is going to be a high beta option as well. This champion tends to come in as more of a counter pick into high mobility compositions. Her inherent base damage and burst can be quite oppressive in certain laning phases. She's definitely weaker with the nerfs to her passive and her E damage, but not to such an extent where she is invisible. She just comes in more as a counter pick now. Tryndamere, also a high beta option. The buffs to him in 14.20, I want to say, benefited him, and he moves up to being a high beta option. Once again, a bit stat checky, but and like if you can really utilize his burst capability, getting those RNG crits, then this champion could be quite valuable. If you're not really using his his oppressive nature of like stat checking people and like really getting full value out of your Fury and your ultimate, then you're once again probably going to look towards other options over him. More like Trundle, for example, who is also a pretty stat checky but easier to play pick at the moment. Renekton, also within my beta. more like a mid B2 option. He does the job. I think that's just what I describe Renekton as. I've kind of gone off Renekton over time. I think there are just better options within the current state of the game. He did lose some power with the likes of Eclipse and Cleaver being quite aggressively nerfed. Well, if you don't have Sterix early, then the champion can feel quite squishy in a lot of games as well. But if you're very comfortable in Renekton, then once again, he's still a perfectly fine champion, which will get the job done in a lot of circumstances. Aurora looks to be a B-tier option at the moment in the top lane for the average player base. In Elite, she does look to be like an S-tier pick. I imagine she'll get nerfed for competitive and Elite at some point soon. So if you enjoy Aurora, play her at the moment, learn her before she does eventually get nerfed. If you're not a huge fan of Aurora, then yeah, once again, you're not going to really look at the champion. But she's fine as a top lane option. Her strength really comes from the two build options you have, whether that's like the Liandry Malignance variant or the Luden Storm Surge, which plays around her burst potential. With that one, you're going more like more down the route of Electrocute and just playing into like squishy compositions where you can really get a lot of value out of your burst. If you're playing into tankier compositions and tankier lanes, then something more like the Grasp Liandry variant can definitely have a lot of value. Kled, Wukong, and Sion wrap up the B-tier. Kled is very unpopular at the moment, but he is fine. He tends to be a bit more matchup dependent, where you can really abuse the the rotations of his passive, getting Scarl up and then looking to dive towers. If you're not in an abusive lane where you can't really get those advantages, then Kled can oftentimes fall a bit flat, but he's still a fine pick. Wukong probably sits towards the lower end of the B tier at the moment. He's definitely had better days, but he does have itemization options, whether that's like you're going down the lethality route, the bruiser route. We've seen some tank variations, but I just don't believe that's the reason why you're going to be playing Wukong. But Grasp does look to be a fine keystone option, that alongside Conqueror, obviously. And this champion, yeah, solid bruiser. Just other things I'd promote over him in his current state. Gnar, I'm going to drop down. So Gnar, I like Gnar. I think Gnar is a great pick. I think he's very versatile in the way he can function within the game. Is he something I'd really recommend for like mid to low elo? Probably not. I think I overrate him having him in the A tier, but he's still a very good B tier pick. Once again, like Aurora, these two champions really benefit from Elite and like where you're really getting max value out of their range and kiting capability. Just something which isn't going to be as consistent in mid elo, in my opinion. Sion, still a good tank option. He also sits towards the high end of the B tier. Can be quite oppressive in laning phase. I think a lot of people kind of disregard that with Sion. They see him as like this infinitely scaling champion, which he is. And obviously, if you get a lot of health, then he can be really valuable later on into the game. But he does have a lot of base damage. Like if you're landing QWE rotations consistently in laning phase, you can oftentimes quite consistently chunk people out and just really dominate lane. So be aware of that. Some, I think, is a bit more skill expressive than what people let on in a lot of situations. So put some time into him. If you're comfortable on him, then yeah, he's a good pick. If you're not, then once again, there are still very solid tank options accessible to you. Galio. So Galio got nerfed this patch. His base mana went from 400 to 310. He lost a decent amount of power from that. Obviously, not being able to cast as many abilities in laning phase can definitely feel quite punishing. Not that I think Galio had aggressive mana problems. I think this just means you're going to be leaning more towards the same build, just mana flow instead of Nimbus, which can feel quite tough within the top lane in situations where you really do value that burst of movement speed. But when you're not really getting as much value out of it from TP and your main Nimbus value is Flash, then yeah, mana flow still a great option. So not a huge amount of power loss there. He's still a great A tier niche pick. Playing him primarily into AP as like a flex option. You're not going to be drafting Galio as like a general pick. He just doesn't really have that kind of strength. His strength comes from his countering capability. Moving on to the other A tier picks. Heimerdinger still within the A tier. I still think this champion's a bit underrated. People people just don't really want to play Heimerdinger at the moment. He's mostly played by his just one trick base, which is perfectly fine. This champion's in a pretty good spot. And if you want to learn Heimerdinger, then I definitely recommend checking out some of the Heimerdinger mains on the ladder. The champ is, yeah, once again, pretty good. He's just pretty unique in the way he functions. Same goes for Singed, also a pretty unique champion, but definitely still very strong when played efficiently, making use of his proxying capabilities, and the kind of like nicheness of his laning phase, which is just not very standard compared to some of the other champions. Why, once again, he is played primarily OTPs. Set, also within my A tier. Very good as being like a full-on aggressive laner. He can be very oppressive if you're rotating like E, auto, and like your Q rotation, it can really be quite hard for like any champion to face up to that. The one problem with Set mainly comes from just his strength in like mid to late game. If you're not ahead of the curve, then this champion will fall really flat. We've actually seen Bwipo play it in the worlds where you can really see Set's weaknesses. If he can't get onto backline and enemy team is like really capable at kiting you and outranging you, then this champion just loses a lot of value. So play him primarily to melee comps where you know you're going to get good advantages in laning phase, and you should definitely have a better time. If you're playing him more generalistically, he definitely does drop down a bit compared to some of the other options which are a bit more consistent generalistically. Malphite got buffed this patch. He gained a very small amount of base health. I believe it pushes him up to 615, which obviously benefits his passive, so you're getting like +2 out of that, which is nice. Not huge, but yeah, it's just like extra on top. Overall, it helped him. He goes from like a low to mid A tier to like a mid A tier champion. Once again, only really going to come out in counter pick situations. You're not playing him into AP matchups. You're mostly just playing him on red side. I mean, if you get given the opportunity to play him on blue side into AD matchups, then yeah, he can still be very powerful. But comes in as a counter pick. Make sure you ban Silas if you're playing Malphite, like if you know you're going to be playing Malphite going to the lane, the champ select. But if you're just playing him as like an open option, he's very easy to pick up. You don't need to put a lot of games into him, and he's still a very solid mid A tier pick. Jack sits towards the lower end of the A tier. The champion is deceptively mechanical, making sure you're manipulating the wave effectively with your E, like holding wave at correct points so you can like gap close onto people and then chase them down the lane. Utilizing your E effectively, just in general matchups, is all very important. It's how you get like the most out of this champion. Overall, I still think Jax is a good pick. I think if you're willing to put a lot of time into him, he could be really valuable to like most arsenals. Jax doesn't really have that many polarizing matchups. So matchups which do nullify him, things like Malphite will just kind of mitigate the impact Jax is ever really able to have within the game, which could definitely be challenging. But as a whole, Jax is a very good champion to learn just as a like pick within the top lane. So yeah, once again, I'd recommend putting time into playing this champion. But if you're not comfortable on him, once again, there are a lot of good options available to you. Kennen is my favourite AP elite pick at the moment, alongside Aurora. I think this champion is great in his current state. If you put a lot of time into Kennen, he can be really valuable addition to most team compositions, especially if you need some AP in the top lane. Maybe you're pairing it alongside like a Viego in the jungle. This champion could be really valuable. Silas is also in my A tier. Once again, comes out primarily as a counter pick, but is still very valuable in most situations. Trundle moves up from the B tier to the A tier. The buff towards lethal tempo did help him. He's very easy to play, very accessible, and I would really recommend him as that kind of like go-to like early in top lane kind of climb champion. If you're looking for something a bit more advanced, then yeah, Trundle's not really going to be something you're looking for, but he definitely does have his strengths in just how easy he is to play and how very linear his playstyle is, with like making sure you're split pushing, getting towers, and start checking the enemy top laner. Cassiopeia and Ryze are my two like mid lane mage options. I think both these champions are really good at the moment. In Cassiopeia's case, she's great into short range compositions where you can really utilize her kiting capability and her miasma, combined with her ultimate. In Ryze's case, he's also very similar, very good into short range compositions where you can really make use of your EQ combo, rotating that effectively within team fights combined with your kiting capability. Both these champions, underrated top laners, in pretty good spots at the moment. Also, not quite as competitive as I would say in Elite as like the Kennens and your Auroras, but very good options, so definitely do sit within my A tier at the moment. Okay, so tank items are an interesting topic. I could honestly make a video about tank items. I don't like Sunfire, I don't like Hollow Radiance. Both these items just aren't very good anymore after the like nerfs towards Barmies. It feels really bad to itemize into them. The main tank items you're looking at are the likes of Fimbulwinter, Unending Despair, Spirits if you have some sort of shield rotation within your kit, things like Tahm Kench or Shen are good examples of this. There are like other options, like you can go into Bramble. Bramble is a good like sit on item, and then like Formel later on it doesn't feel as good anymore after the nerfs to it, but it's still fine there. In Ornn's case, he doesn't, I mean, you kind of value things like Sunfire and Hollow Radiance, which feels bad in a lot of situations. I don't think you need them. I think you can go things like Fimbulwinter into things like Unending Despair, and then Spirits is like a third option when you're rotating the shields and healing quite effectively within the game, especially into like AP compositions. Into AD, you can just go full mill. And I think you can skip Sunfire Hollow Radiance. If you're not comfortable doing it and you really do value the Wave Clear Edition on these items, then there are definitely still things you can opt into. You're just going to feel a bit weaker on like a 3-item spike with these items, as they don't really have that good scaling power within the game anymore. Sunfire lost its ramping damage, which feels really bad. But Ornn, yeah, good champion. I really like Ornn. I used to play a lot of Ornn. I think this champion, like, as an inherent draft value, is very good. And can be played in a lot of compositions. You do just have to be careful with some of the matchups. If you're playing into a very aggressive and sharp matchup, things like a good Fiora, then you will really get punished. But you're just not going to run into those that much if you're like Emerald below. So you don't really need to be as like cognitive or aware of those situations. Urgot is going to move up to the S tier. I mean, I'll talk about him now, though. Urgot is my main champion. I really like Urgot. I haven't played as much of him this split, but he's definitely doing quite well with the some of the iterations you can opt into. We've seen some Sphere of Shoujins, Hullbreaker is a good option. We've seen some different rune choices, whether that's for Fleet, the PTA, the Phase Rush. There's definitely a lot of options accessible to you. You can go Lethality, you can go Bruiser. Starix isn't as necessary as it has been in the past, but it's still a very good item on him. And overall, his flexibility in build paths have just kind of enabled him to push back up into the S tier with some of the other champions which have dropped out of the S tier. Some of the champions which have dropped out of the S tier then, we have Volibear, we have Yorick, and we have one other, Nasus. So in Volibear, actually in the case of all three, they did get nerfed this patch. Yorick lost some damage on his ghouls, Volibear lost some cooldown on his E, meaning he can't rotate as much damage within a fight and like shielding within a fight, which can definitely add up within game, so he does drop down a slight bit there. In Yorick's case, yeah, the ghoul damage definitely does hurt him quite a bit, so he does also drop down a tier. And Nasus lost some damage on his Q, combined with another nerf, which I can't remember off the top of my head. Nerf towards his passive lifesteal, 3% off that, which is actually pretty big. So those sizable nerfs do drop him from the S tier to the A tier, but all three of these champions are still top of the A tier picks. They're still very good. I just think things like Alawi are a bit more competitive now as good options. This champion really is like doing quite well at the moment, especially with some of the itemization she is accessible to her. The other pick here was Warwick, I believe. Yeah, Warwick is also still a very good A tier pick. And honestly, like the top of the A tier here, like these 5 picks, and then like Malphite is like a counter pick option, all very good. And what I'd recommend is like good low elo pool. The S tier, also very good low elo pool. The other picks I'm going to recommend. Cho'Gath is also here. Cho'Gath, very good stat sticky kind of tank at the moment. They gave him a lot of base damage buffs, and it did really help him be a lot more accessible within the game. He does still have the issue of being a very slow, immobile tank, which can definitely feel quite punishing in today's climate, but yeah, the stat stick buff towards his Q and his E really did help him quite aggressively. The S tier picks then, actually there's one more A tier pick. In Aatrox's case, he's actually doing a lot better at the moment. People have started moving over to Sphere of Shoujin and Voltaic Cyclosword as really good options on him. So just be aware, there's a lot of movement in Aatrox's build, and if you're very comfortable on Aatrox, then I think this is a good time to pick him up and like start doing some build variations and just seeing what you're comfortable on. So yeah, I'm gonna move him up from the B tier to the A tier as a good pick. So yeah, definitely be aware of that. My S tier then. So I have 6 champions here, which are still all really good in their own regard. I'll lead with Tahm Kench. So in Tahm Kench's case, he's got the 2 build variations. He's got the tank variation and the hybrid AP variation, which is like your Heartsteel, Riftmaker, Protobell, Rabadon's Death Cap kind of build, which is really powerful and gives you a lot more carry potential. It honestly like changes your shape as a champion into more like a Mordekaiser champion, where your isolated 1v1 potential is just some of the best in the game. Does still have the vulnerability of being relatively immobile, but if you're getting Heartsteel stacks and you're rotating like your combos effectively within the game, then this champion can act almost like a long range artillery mage with his tongue when you have a lot of size increase. So there's definitely a lot of power to this pick. I really do value him quite highly as a low elo top lane pick. So yeah, go ahead, play him if you're comfortable on him, but you can definitely get some free LP out of this pick. Shen is my current go-to champion. I think Shen is probably the best champion in the top lane at the moment, like generalistically. People just don't really understand how to play against Shen. They oftentimes just let him get away with just ulting cross map and then for either freezing on him, so he only loses a few creeps, or just not really sieging his tower when they should be. If you're running into Shen and your champion has access to things like Demolish, you can oftentimes just take his tower pre 12 minutes in a lot of situations if he's ulting ineffectively. If people don't do this, then this champion is one of the best picks you can have access to at the moment, as he can completely manipulate fights on the other side of the rift with just the press of a button. So Shen, really do recommend this champion at the moment. His base damage is incredible, his build is incredible. I would almost always recommend going Heart, Steel, Spirit, Unending Despair, or Unending Despair Spirit, depending on what you're laying against. If you need the armor, then yeah, that's something you opt into. And into matchups which they like pick up things like Bork or Ravenous, then things like a Bramble pickup can be quite nice, like pre Heartsteel finish. But Shen, yeah, great pick at the moment. Mordekaiser, also amazing pick at the moment. I know a lot of people have trouble trying to translate this pick later on into the game, obviously because he's a mobile and people oftentimes will just kite you out. That is definitely a vulnerability of this champion, but just how valuable he is as a stat stick option and like being able to just isolate someone, take them down, and then oftentimes do a lot more work than just that. Just gives him so much power within the game. If you ever fall behind, then he can definitely struggle a bit more, but you can still just ult the things like a support, which still just makes it a 4v4 even if you are behind the curve. So there's still definitely value there. He does get punished a lot more the higher rank you go, so that is just something to be aware of. But as like a mid to low elo pick, he's perfect. Like, he's one of the best options you have access to. Mundo, I mean, we all know Mundo, very good stat sticky health stacking tank. This champion obviously prints AD, prints health. Once you have heart still, it's just a nice rotation which you're feeding into itself. The pick obviously can be a bit more vulnerable early on into the game, and they did nerf his scaling in 14.20, so he did lose a bit of power there, but he's still very good. He's still a very powerful champion, and if you pick up heart still, get the stacks going, then he can be very unstoppable by the time he hits level 16. And Zac, I mean, he's the least popular of the 6 options here, I believe. I think he like sits next to Tahm Kenshin and how unpopular he is. But people don't punish Zac that effectively. If you, the way you want to punish Zac obviously is you stand on his blobs, you deny him of being able to pick up that health. That is like the core way of playing against him. But people don't do that. They enable him to like stack his blobs, like pick them up, obviously get more rotations of W within the laning phase, and that can all like ramp up to being a very effective early to mid lane bully. Not so much like level like first 5 levels, but once you hit 6, once you have access to that ultimate where you can like really comfortably dive onto someone and chunk them for most of their HP, this pick is really valuable. So Zac, definitely one of my S tier picks. I think he's a great tank option. He doesn't scale as aggressively as like the other options here. I'd say he's probably the worst in terms of scaling, as he doesn't have access to things like heart still, and his built like past level 13 he just doesn't really scale that well. Like points in Q just aren't really that effective compared to what some of the other champions here have access to. But he, yeah, is one of the best mid game champions out there. He can cause a lot of disruption, he does a lot of base damage, and that can all be really valuable within a lot of compositions. He also has great dive, obviously. If you can jump on an ADC consistently, this champ can be really valuable. And that is why S tier. I think these picks are all really good. They're all stat checky in most parts, but that's primarily like going to benefit mid to low elo players. So, if this was an elite tier list, then a lot of these champions do kind of drop down a bit, as they're a lot more punishable and exploitable, which people just won't do in the lower ranks. So in Emerald, below, yeah, all these picks really good. They all still work quite comfortably into Diamond, and yeah, we'll begin to struggle a bit more into Masters, but for like 95% of our player base, then yeah, these are the picks you want to look at as being like good power options at the moment. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.